Looking back at 70 some odd years, you realize life doesn't always follow the script you wrote for yourself when you were 20. I married my husband, Jim, when I was 25, and back then, I truly believed I was headed for an ordinary, happy life. We had a modest little life planned out in our small town in Ohio, a house with a porch, a garden out back, and a brood of children running through the sprinklers in the summer. We thought we had all the time in the world. But fate has a way of turning the page when you aren't ready. When our son Ben was only 10 years old, Jim was taken from us suddenly. I remember the day so clearly. The sky was that bruised shade of purple before a summer storm. One day, we were a family of 3, and the next, the silence in our house was so heavy I could feel it in my bones. I was a widow at 35, standing in a kitchen that felt too big, looking at a young boy who still needed a father to show him how to bait a hook and how to be a man. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late that first month, the bills spread out like a deck of cards I didn't know how to play. From that day on, I carried the weight of 2 roles, mother and father. I made a promise to Ben that night, though he was fast asleep. I promised him he'd never feel the empty that Jim left behind. I took a job at the local manufacturing plant during the day and pulled shifts at the diner down the road most evenings. I became the one who cheered at his little league games with grease still under my fingernails, and the one who stayed up until midnight sewing patches onto his jeans so he wouldn't feel less than the other kids at school. Those years were a blur of tired eyes and the smell of industrial cleaner and coffee. I swallowed my pride and my exhaustion every single day. There were nights I was so tired, I'd just sit in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes, staring at the dash, just trying to find the strength to walk inside and cook dinner with a smile on my face. I didn't want Ben to see the weight I was carrying. I wanted him to see a mother who was strong, even if I felt like I was breaking apart inside. Ben was a quiet child, observant in a way that sometimes broke my heart. He grew up watching my sacrifices. He rarely complained about the things we couldn't afford, the expensive sneakers or the new video games. Instead, he'd sit at the kitchen table, his nose buried in his textbooks, studying by the light of a single lamp to save on the electric bill. He never caused trouble because he knew, deep down, that every grade he earned was a step toward a better life for both of us. I remember one winter in Ohio when the heater broke. We couldn't afford the repairman right away, so we huddled in the living room with every blanket we owned. Ben didn't complain once. He just pulled his chair closer to mine and kept reading his history book. He knew every page he studied was another step toward repaying me for the life I was trying to give him. At the time, I didn't understand what it all meant, how much he was really taking in. I just kept pushing, kept sacrificing, wondering if I was doing enough. What happened years later is something I'll never forget. But back then, I was just a woman trying to keep her head above water. Time doesn't just pass when you're a parent, it gallops. Before I knew it, those days of Little League and patched knees had turned into late-night study sessions and college applications. I'll never forget the afternoon the mailman, old Mr. Henderson, walked all the way up to my porch instead of just leaving the mail in the box. He had a look on his face like he'd won the lottery himself. He handed me a thick white envelope addressed to Ben. When Ben got home from his shift at the grocery store, we opened it together at that same kitchen table where we'd eaten so many humble meals. He'd done it. He'd graduated top of his class and won a full academic scholarship to the state university. I cried right there, my tears splashing onto the official-looking letterhead. All those double shifts at the diner, all the missed dinners, the times I'd skipped buying a new coat for myself so he could have the books he needed. It felt like they finally meant something. But the transition wasn't easy. Watching him pack his life into a few cardboard boxes broke my heart in a way I hadn't expected. When the day came to drive him to the city, the house felt like it was already mourning his absence. The drive was long, past the rolling hills and the familiar farms of our county, and as the city skyline began to rise up like a wall of glass and steel, I felt a lump in my throat. I was so proud of him, but I was terrified of the world he was entering, a world I didn't know how to protect him from anymore. Ben, ever the observant son, must have seen me gripping the steering wheel. He reached over and put his hand on mine. "Don't worry, Mom," he said softly. "I'm going to make you proud, and I'm going to take care of you." At the time, I just thought he was being a sweet boy, trying to soothe his old mother's nerves. I didn't realize how much he truly meant those words. While he was studying in the city, he worked harder than I ever could have imagined. He didn't just study, he took part-time jobs, tutoring underclassmen, working late nights in the university library, so I wouldn't have to send him a dime of my meager paycheck. He'd call me every Sunday night and we'd talk for an hour. He'd tell me about his classes, and I'd tell him about the garden and the neighbors, but he never mentioned how tired he must have been. He was just like me, I realized. He carried his burdens in silence, so I wouldn't worry. Then came Sarah. He met her during his senior year, a lovely, gentle girl who worked in an office in the city. The first time he brought her home to our small town, I was so nervous. I cleaned that house until my knuckles were raw, worried that a city girl wouldn't find our modest home good enough. But Sarah walked in, saw the photo of Jim on the mantel, and gave me a hug that felt like she'd known me her whole life. When they got married a few years later, a small ceremony in a park, I felt like my job was finally done. I'd raised a good man, and he'd found a good woman to walk beside him. The years kept rolling by, and in 2023, Ben and Sarah called me with big news. They were finally ready to buy their first home. My heart soared for them, but I also felt a familiar pang of maternal duty. I had been tucking money away for 30 years, a $5 bill here, a 20 there, hidden in an old cookie jar, and then eventually moved into a small savings account I'd barely touched. It amounted to about $20,000. I'd saved it specifically for a moment like this. I took the bus to the city, the envelope of my life savings tucked deep in my purse. When we sat down in their small apartment to talk about their plans, I pulled it out and pushed it across the table. "I want you to have this," I said, my voice trembling a little, "for the down payment. It's not much, but it's yours." Ben looked at the envelope, then at Sarah, and then back at me. He didn't even open it. He just took my hands in his and shook his head. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place, "you keep that. That's for your retirement. You've given us enough already. You've given me everything." I felt a little hurt, if I'm honest. A mother wants to keep giving even when she has nothing left to give. I felt like I was being told I wasn't needed anymore. But they wouldn't hear another word about the money. Instead, they insisted I stay for a few days to celebrate their news. I was worried. At my age, you feel like a burden, like an old piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit in a modern room. I thought I'd be in the way of their busy city lives, their fast-paced jobs, and their sophisticated friends. But those few days were the happiest I'd been since Jim passed. Every evening, no matter how busy their jobs were, they both made it a point to come home and have dinner with me. Sarah would ask me about my garden back home, and she'd cook my favorite pot roast, making sure it was seasoned just the way I liked it. They treated me like I was the guest of honor, not an old woman taking up space on the sofa. On the final morning of my visit, the air was crisp and smelled of rain. As I was packing my few things, Sarah came into the guest room holding a simple plastic grocery bag. "Mom," she said gently, "I was cleaning out the closet and found some old clothes I was going to get rid of. I thought maybe you could use them, for working in the garden or just wearing around the house." I looked at her, then at the bag. I didn't want to be a bother, so I just smiled and thanked her. "That's very kind of you, Sarah. I'm sure I can find a use for them." I tucked the bag into my suitcase, thinking it was just a few old sweaters and shirts. We said our goodbyes at the bus station, and as I watched them wave through the window of the departing bus, I felt a strange mix of sadness and peace. That moment stayed with me for the rest of my life, but I wouldn't realize why until I got home. The bus ride back to Ohio felt longer than usual. I watched the city skyline disappear in the rearview mirror, replaced by the familiar green fields and weathered barns of the countryside. I kept thinking about the look in Ben's eyes when he refused my money. I kept thinking about the way Sarah had cared for me, making sure I was comfortable every second I was in her home. It's a strange thing getting older. You spend your life being the one who provides, the one who protects, and suddenly you're the one being looked after. It's a hard pill to swallow sometimes. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house felt quiet, the way it always does after a visit. The silence wasn't heavy like it had been after Jim died. It was more like a soft blanket. I walked into my kitchen, the same one where I'd sat through countless nights of worry, and set my suitcase on the floor. I was tired from the trip, but I wanted to get those clothes into the wash so I could use the bag for the trash. I sat down at the table, pulled the plastic bag toward me, and reached inside. The first thing I pulled out was a thick navy blue wool cardigan. As soon as my fingers touched the fabric, I froze. This wasn't old. It was the softest, finest wool I'd ever felt. I turned it over in my hands and saw the tag still pinned to the sleeve, a brand from one of those fancy shops in the city I'd been too intimidated to even walk into. It was expensive, far more expensive than anything I'd ever bought for myself. My heart started to thump a little harder in my chest. I reached back into the bag and pulled out a flannel shirt, then another sweater in a soft sea glass green, my favorite color. Every single piece was brand new. Every single piece still had the tags on it. I sat there bewildered. Why would Sarah lie to me? Why would she tell me these were old clothes she was throwing away? I felt a rush of confusion, almost a bit of embarrassment. Did they think I looked so ragged that I needed charity? But as I moved the navy blue cardigan again, I felt something heavy in the right pocket. I reached in, my fingers brushing against paper. I pulled out a thick white envelope. My name, Mom, was written in Ben's unmistakable, steady handwriting. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the envelope open. When the seal finally gave way, a stack of $100 bills slid out onto the table. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. I counted them, not once, but 3 times. It was $20,000, the exact amount I had tried to give them for their house. There was a letter tucked inside the money. I unfolded it, the paper crinkling in the quiet kitchen. "Mom," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you're home and you finally looked in the bag. We knew you'd never let us buy you anything new if we asked. We've watched you your whole life, Mom. We saw you wear the same winter coat for 15 years so I could have new cleats for baseball. We saw you skip meals so I could go on that school trip to D.C. You spent your whole life wearing hand-me-downs and thrift store finds so that I could have the best of everything. Sarah and I wanted you to have something beautiful that was just for you. We wanted you to feel the warmth of something new, something that wasn't a sacrifice. And we wanted you to have your savings back. We told you they were old clothes because we knew that was the only way you would accept them without a fight. We love you, Mom. You've spent 30 years taking care of everyone else. It's finally your turn to be taken care of." I sat there in the silence of my kitchen and I just cried. I cried for the tired woman I used to be, the one who worked those double shifts until her feet bled. I cried for the young widow who thought she'd never feel whole again. And I cried for the man my son had become. A man who understood that love isn't just about what you say, but about the quiet ways you honor the people who paved the road for you. I realized then that they hadn't seen a burden when I visited. They hadn't seen an old woman who was in the way. They saw the woman who was their foundation. The old clothes trick wasn't just about the money or the sweaters. It was about protecting my dignity. They knew my pride would have kept me from accepting a gift, so they gave me a favor instead. Years later, I finally realized why she did that. It wasn't just about clothes or money. It was about dignity and love. As we get older, we worry. We worry about being forgotten or about our children being too busy with their own lives to remember the sacrifices we made. But the love you pour into them is never truly lost. It's like a seed you plant in a garden you might not live to see fully bloom, but one day you'll look out the window and see the most beautiful colors you've ever imagined. The love you give your children may take years to come back to you, but when it does, I promise you, it comes back warmer, deeper, and more beautiful than you ever imagined. Don't ever doubt the value of your sacrifice. Every bit of it is seen. Every bit of it matters. And in the end, the harvest is always worth the wait.